as we talk about coaching through the pandemic. Holly is a veteran science educator, um, and she is very excited. We're super excited to have her because she is a brilliant educator. And she recently turned into an instructional tech facilitator and loves to create and implement classroom frameworks while leading others to do the same. Her leadership experience in instructional coaching transforms classrooms through collaboration, personalized professional development, and individualized goal setting, which helps her teachers ensure that they are growing learning environments where all her students are challenged to communicate, critically think, create, and share every day. So we are excited to have her. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to her.
I am super excited to be here. Thank you, Brittany, for such a warm welcome. So a little bit about me. I am in Dare County. I am a relatively new instructional coach after spending 24 years in the secondary science classroom, where I serve students in grades 7 through 12, all the way from introductory science to the AP level. I taught AP biology and AP chemistry for quite some time. So I've seen the entire gamut of secondary education, serving on MTSS teams, PBIS teams, and a lot of school level teams that opened my eyes to the needs of all learners and how when you look at learner characteristics, we really do serve a diverse population. So I came into the instructional coach position. My actual title is an instructional technology facilitator. Interestingly enough, I hold NCDLC and responsible for my career goals, because when I went to NCDLC and as a participant, I didn't even know there was such a thing as an instructional technology facilitator. And once I was introduced to that role, I realized that was what I wanted to become. And so I began building a portfolio thanks to that experience, as well as my future experience as a mentor in that program, building a portfolio and looking for opportunities where I could serve in this capacity. And the pandemic, while it has been it's been tough, but it certainly has been an adventure and an opportunity for me as a new instructional coach. I started as an instructional coach last January. So I had about 8 weeks in the building, the last 2 of which we were watching the western side of our country slowly close down, and we were watching that wave of school closures move towards the East Coast. So we knew it was happening. What we didn't realize, I think, is the impact that it would have on not only our teachers and learners, but those of us who support teachers and learners in the building. So my job went from being the Chromebook girl, the one responsible for making sure that everyone's laptops and projectors, document cameras, and MobiPads work, to instead really supporting instructional design in my building. And I'd like to walk you through how we took a framework very strategically in our building and moved it from survival mode to thrive mode. And now that we have kids back in the building, a little bit of what that continues to look like. If you have questions, comments, resources, please drop them in the chat box as we're going through this. So like I said, we looked at the pandemic as an opportunity for teacher growth. We were looking at 2 major frameworks in our building going into second semester of last year. The first framework that we were looking at is differentiation. And I think in a lot of buildings that, especially secondary, that's a tough topic because we reach a lot of resistance. We see a lot of resistance with the amount of time that takes. What does it look like to plan it? And how do you create differentiated strategies as a sustainable methodology in secondary classrooms? Teachers also see that they're teaching to one standardized assessment. And so they struggle to see, where does differentiation fit when all of my students are taking the same assessment at the end of the year? So we were really looking at, what does differentiation look like? What does rigor look like at all levels? And then student engagement. Student engagement was huge. We were doing a lot of equity work on, are all students, all learners engaged in content, and how do you know? So we were looking at questioning strategies. What types of questions are you asking? How are you receiving responses from students? And coaching teachers on those particular areas, specifically in mathematics. What we found, however, when we moved into emergency remote learning, so now I think our school is on remote 7.0, so to speak, because we're in our 7th iteration of what school looks like. And every single time we've been able to maintain our focus on student engagement through very strategic coaching opportunities. So for us, we saw emergency remote learning and then moving into remote learning, moving into a hybrid situation. And now that we're going back completely face to face when we return from spring break, we've tried to frame this all as opportunities for student growth and teacher growth. I am very, very lucky because I work in a building where we practice distributed leadership. We have a lot of great teachers who lead in our building with decision making. We have mobilized leadership at all levels in our building. But what this requires, and this can be a challenge and a transition for new leaders in our building, is that it requires a lot of transparency, trust, and communication. But it is really important because what happens as a result of this distributed leadership model is that we have faster, I think, organizational movement, and we see more buy-in across multiple levels because every single person has the opportunity to have a voice in major decision making, particularly in the way that those changes are implemented. We might not have a lot of voice in what the change is, but we certainly can have a lot of voice in what that change looks like and how it rolls out to teachers and students. So we leverage teacher voice and student voice whenever the opportunities lend themselves to do so. What are our challenges with distributed leadership? Of course, whenever you have new changes or new leadership that wants to push a change through, whether that leadership is at the building or the district level, there's always conflict between the change and the current culture in the building and present practices. And that's where we've run into some instructional challenges. But what we have found is that if you have a few teacher leaders, which we will fondly call runners, for those of you who are familiar with the book, Move the Bus. Strong, supportive, collaborative professional learning communities have helped with this movement. We support planning, design, we have consistency in our messaging across leadership and across PLCs. And then we do create places where we have flexibility. That means that the teachers can have a huge voice in what this is going to look like. And we invite radical candor. That can be really tough for someone who's never been in a workplace that invites radical candor, but we know, because it's part of our messaging and it's part of our culture that we have worked really hard to establish, that radical candor is what's going to get us to a better product. And we leverage those better products to further improve the use of radical candor at all levels. And that's hard. It's hard to have radical candor with a colleague that you've never spoken with in that way before. And so that's been a hurdle that we've worked diligently to overcome. And every day we're a little bit better. So one of the things that I started with last January, so again, I am only 2 months older as an instructional coach than the pandemic. One of the things that I recognized that I needed to do was build relationships. But when we closed on March 13th, I had to build relationships quickly. And I will be the first to tell you that I was walking into very, very large shoes. The instructional technology facilitator who had the position before me had been there for a very, very long time, had wonderful relationships with the teachers. So I was filling big shoes. And then secondly, I was entering the position amidst a huge hardware change in our building, which upset a lot of teachers. So I was already labeled the bad guy because I was changing some of the available technology in the classrooms. That wasn't my decision, but I was the person actually physically taking the things out of the rooms. So I had to come up with a way to get into teachers' spaces, whether that was in their professional learning community, whether that was in their planning sessions with their like course teacher, or whether that was actually observing in their classrooms. And so the first thing that I did was figure out how to build relationships. What was the hardware change? The hardware change was every teacher in my building, nearly every teacher in my building had 2 computers, a desktop and a laptop, and we took the desktops. And so they were using the desktops as their projector. That's what their projector hooked up to, and it was hardwired. And we had to take those out because they were no longer supported by our network. So our teachers went from 2 devices down to 1. And that was a huge adjustment because they had never, ever worked off of just their laptop. And so that forced them to really expand how they used their laptop. So in a way, the pandemic helped in that situation because it forced them to learn some of the available features on their laptop. It forced them to learn how to use 2 screens, like many of you are probably using right now at this very moment. And it forced them to really become more adept at the features that they already had at their fingertips. And so now that we've re-entered the classroom, they've been able to transition that skill set and invite the projector as part of that, as that hardware, where I don't think that they would have done so swiftly had we stayed in the building. And yes, it's a fear of change. I think it's a fear of making a mistake in a public setting. They really want to make sure that they have seamless transitions in their classrooms. And I think they fear getting stuck or hitting a wrong button. And we've had a lot of conversations about making a mistake, and it's okay to make a mistake in front of your kids. I actually make mistakes in front of them all the time, and sometimes on purpose, just to show them that, hey, I'm the instructional technology facilitator. I'm going to hit the button. If you guys were at the beginning of the call, you recognize that I didn't know where the closed captioning was to turn it on the slides feature. So it's okay not to know. And I think some of them now are more comfortable with working their way through. Things might not be perfect, but that's okay because we're working with kids and we're humans, and we just have to give ourselves the same grace that we give others. So my first step back to my coaching cycle was to build relationships. I mean, relationships, but how do you build relationships with teachers who really don't want you in their classrooms? You know, I work with a very seasoned group of teachers, and they didn't want me in their classrooms. They were very content with me just making sure the kids have Chromebooks, make sure my technology is working, and just leave me alone. And so I worked hard with some strategic water cooler conversations to find out what are some ways that I can make them work faster, work smarter, save time, automate things, create templates, all of those things. And so I switched my professional development design from requesting that students or that teachers stay an hour after school or give up their planning to professional development on demand. I also started some very intentional coaching conversations with teachers on those, what I mentioned earlier, the equity questioning standards, like how are you getting your students engaged in the remote environment, and what are some ways that we can make that happen a little bit faster, a little bit more efficiently, so that you're not spending as much time doing some things that might be more that we could automate. So that's how I wiggled my way into some of the spaces to invite conversations with teachers on an instructional level, because I was able to help them with something, whether it was an instructional design, whether it was transforming something from a paper document to something that could be utilized in a digital space, or whether it was just serving as their wingman in a digital classroom. So they had someone to manage the chat box while they were working on something else, or help them in the background because they were doing something new. Whatever helped them, I was there. And I found myself, surprisingly enough, very busy. But what that did was it built relationships. And so then when I started to ask can I come visit your classroom? Or if a teacher had planned something with me or had bounced a couple of ideas off me, I would just ask, oh, I really would love to see that in action. Can I come to your class and watch? Then they were fine with it. And some people I just cold asked. And when I did that, they loved having me in their classroom because I always wrote 5 or 6 awesome things that I saw while I was there. Those awesome things ended up in my weekly newsletter. I have a section in our principal's weekly newsletter, and I use that to showcase great things that I'm seeing in classrooms. They were getting applause there. The principal saw that applause. Now, I never shared the nuances of what I saw in classrooms once I got into a coaching cycle with a teacher, and I'll explain that in just a minute. But the teacher had that evidence if they ever wanted to use that as a summative. I would give shout outs, and then I would ask what if questions, or I wonder questions, or if I saw something great but didn't know how the teacher got to that point. The kids seem very comfortable doing this. How did you get to this point? I would ask them to unpack that. And before you knew it, the teacher was in a coaching cycle with me and had no idea it was happening. So then I would say, hey, do you mind if we document this? And then I would explain why. In the documentation cycle, in this conversation, it's just a written documentation of, what did I see? What are your goals? What do I wonder? What are some ideas that I have? And then we would engage in a conversation. Now, one of the parts of this conversation that I think is really, really important is doing a pulse check on your teachers. So prior to investing in this conversation, I made sure that I understood, and I've got this document linked in here. In fact, it is linked right here with my coaching kickoff. In my coaching kickoff, before I get to the point where I am documenting the conversation, I make sure that I'm documenting the conversation in a way that the teacher is comfortable. So I learn using that coaching kickoff, once they've agreed to invest in this coaching cycle with me, how do you want your feedback? Do you want it in just a digital document that we bounce back and forth? I've got really busy teachers, and the majority of my teachers, that's all they want. They just want to bounce back and forth. I have some, they want to have a phone conversation because they have an hour-long drive in the afternoons, and that's a great way for them to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So we'll set up a phone chat. Some of them wanted a video chat or an in-person conversation, depending on what our COVID regulations were at that given time. So I make sure that I match my conversation to what they want. Secondly, yes, the link is in the slides, Jen. And I think it's a few slides down in the resources document. The second thing that I ask them is, how do you want your feedback? Do you want me to cut to the chase and not give you any fluff? Or do you want me to sweeten the pot? Or do you want to balance? And then lastly, when do you want to have the conversation? Do you want to have the conversation right when you get your data from your observation? Or do you want me to give you some time so you can process it? In all of those situations, the teacher has the voice, and I match to their needs because I can adapt to whatever they need. And so I've found that by really paying attention to how they answer those questions, the teachers can receive the information that I share. Even if they say they want to cut to the chase, I make absolutely sure that I lead with the great things that I see in their classroom. So here, a little bit about what I can offer them, match those with what their goals, and define the expectations of the coaching cycle. From there, I observe. I never call it an observation. I call it an instructional partnership because I'm not an evaluator and I don't want them to see me that way. I can help them. I can support them. I'm a peer, but I'm not an evaluator, so I don't use the word observation in any of my conversations. I give them feedback that has several parts. I've got an example of the template that I use. What data did I see? Now, for the very intentional work that we're doing with our math team, I actually have mathematical data about how they asked questions and what the responses look like with percentages of who responded. So they can see, okay, out of 25 students that you have in the class, 22 were present in your virtual class. and 12 responded. Or it might say, you used these tools that showed 100% participation, but then when you used the chat box, you only had 40% participation. And when you used audio and students unmiked, you had 4% participation. We actually do a very strategic mapping system for questions in our math department that we're expanding to our other departments next year, because our data has been so informative and so life-changing for our teachers. But that was very specific work with just our math teachers that they knew up front. Data, glows, lots of glows, and then 1 or 2 grows with an actionable step. I try to find an instructional video of what that might look like, or maybe a strategy card. Let's say that think, pair, share, and they don't know what think, pair, share is. I'll try to find an activity card or create one to walk them through what that could look like. And then we offer, or I offer, a conversation that then helps them plan the next session or 2 or 3. We start looking at their curriculum, looking at what's coming up next. How can they weave an action step? Or maybe they don't like that action step. Maybe we need to pick a different one, and that's okay, because this is their instructional practice, not mine. And then they reflect on their work. They then pick the date and they invite me back in, which is always within 2 weeks. From there, I just repeat. 2 weeks later, how are we doing on that actionable step? Do we need to continue it with a little tweaking? Is it working? Maybe we can move to differentiation at this point. Or maybe that's a consistent part of the teacher's practice and we can start looking at something completely different. The teacher is always driving the train. And so now we're going back. And so this has been a big conversation in my building, and we've worked so diligently on engagement, multiplying yourself. How can you be present in that student's life at 6 o'clock at night because they didn't do your live meet? How can you leverage all of these tools that we've been using to maximize student engagement, investment, and access when we come back? Those are our conversations right now. And so now we are looking at taking these tools and using them for differentiated blended practices. I mentioned just a second ago the coaching kickoff. This is actually a link to the kickoff document that my teachers, they fill out, and it not only shares with me how they like to receive feedback, but it tells them the expectations that they can expect of me. And then here's an example of the coaching tracker, and what I just take that, I think it has 2 or 3 documents on it, or 2 or 3 fields on it. And then every single time we meet, I just add another tracker to the bottom. This is really important because it is only shared. This might answer the question that's in the chat box. How much of what I do is shared with admin? This coaching tracker is only visible by me and the teacher. However, the teacher can choose to use this as support, as a supporting document for their summative at the end of the year if they want to. And so as we're going through the documentation during our post-observation conferences, one of the things that I'll mention to them is, you did a great job of illustrating your this particular standard in the teacher evaluation. And so we'll go through a number different pieces of the teacher evaluation. So if that isn't evident in one of their observations, they now have a document that shows that, no, my assistant principal didn't see it when she did the evaluation of me, but the coach did, and I have documentation of that. It is the voice of the teacher to share this information with the admin staff, not me. It is not my document. It belongs to the teacher. So I don't share any of this information with the administrative team. On one exception, I have 2 teachers that I'm currently working with because they have been assigned to me by the administrative team. So those 2 teachers, that information is shared with the admin, but that is an understanding prior to coaching cycles ever starting. And that matches a particular goal that the leadership team has set for them, that I was brought into as an assistant. I also summarize some of the work. I'm working with one beginning teacher, and so I use the information from these coaching cycles to summarize the paperwork for their beginning teacher paperwork at the district level. Again, the teacher knows that going into it, and I make sure that any information that is shared outside of my space, it has their blessing. So I shared this information, and I'm happy to share other information that I mentioned with you guys. And then I also shared some articles that have driven some of our conversations in our buildings. And if you have questions, comments, resources to share, Brittany? Or if you have something afterwards, you're thinking about it, you're looking at implementing it with your folks, and you have deeper questions or specific scenarios, my contact information is also in the slide deck, and you can find me on Twitter.
Those were some great suggestions. Thank you, Holly, for sharing. It's been a very different year, but it definitely is a challenge to build those relationships and coach with everything going on. So kudos to you.
It's been really fun. I think that it provided an opportunity to build relationships that would have been slower to build. And it's been an opportunity also to really share in the successes that our teachers have experienced, how much growth they've experienced. We just look at where we were a year ago and think, gosh, sometimes you really need to pause and give yourself a pat on the back for how far you've come.
Absolutely. Absolutely.